Tayyip Erdogan was the prime minister of Turkey. He is now the president of Turkey. Well, if you don't like him because he's a bit of a fundamentalist, you have good reason to. I'm going to explain why in a second. You should be happy. The presidential role in Turkey's government is largely ceremonial. You know, you go to some dinners, you go to some funerals, kind of like our vice president here in the United States of America. Well, now that Erdogan is in charge, he thinks, I don't think so. I think the president's going to have a lot more power. Of course, this is the old Putin move. I'm prime minister, no, I'm president, no, I'm prime minister. What? I'm term limits, I'm totally fine with it. Yeah, I keep bouncing around. Somehow I'm always running the country. So Erdogan was expected to win this election. I'll tell you the exact vote in a second, and of course he did win. But a lot of people are scratching their heads if you don't live inside Turkey, because there's been a lot of controversy surrounding Erdogan. And you're wondering how he might have won. Remember all those protests that we covered on the show, the Gezi Park protests, and it was really out of control for a while. There was the fire cannons. You remember they would put stuff, mace in the water, and they'd shoot that out, and so that the water looked like fire was coming out, and it had pepper spray in it. Well, 11 people were killed in the protests, and 8,000 were injured. So it was quite significant, and people are still very, very mad about that. And then recently there was a mining disaster in Soma, Turkey, 301 dead miners. Now, Erdogan went down there to show sympathy, but he did no such thing. Instead, he said, quote, "What happened, happened. It's from God." That sounds like our right-wingers, right? And apparently there's even grainy video footage of a man who was booing him, and Erdogan, the prime minister of the country, slaps the guy across the face. Damn. And he still won the election. So now people are mad about Gezi Park. They're mad about the mining and how he apparently doesn't care that much about it. And then he banned Twitter. And then he banned YouTube. And those bans got lifted eventually, but they were significant for a while. Why? Because he wants all the media under his control. In fact, there's telephone calls of Erdogan calling the heads of the media organizations and saying, "I don't like that report you made. You better make sure that you take that reporter off the air." And one of them cries. He says, okay, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm so sorry. God, it's so sad. The largest multimedia company in Turkey, he didn't like their reports. He fined them $1 billion. That's just taking $1 billion out of their pocket. So this is not going well, right? This is not a guy that I agree with. I'm secular. He's fundamentalist. I got no interest in this guy. And then to make things even worse, recently, he went and said, look, we don't tolerate anti-Semitism in Turkey. And I was like, oh, great. Okay, thank God he said that, right? And he said Turkey and Israel and the Jewish people have had centuries of great relationships. Great, that's absolutely true. And I was like, oh, thank God he's saying it, okay? And then he went on to say, but if you're Jewish in Turkey, you should show loyalty to Turkey and understand what that means. I'm like, oh, for Christ's sake. That's exactly the kind of anti-Semitism Jews have been dealing with all across the world. And if that wasn't bad enough, then he accused one of his opponents in the election of being Israel's man, okay? So it just kept getting worse and worse. That's not bringing people together, obviously. That's splitting them apart. So what did he win by? Well, he won with 51% of the vote. Now, this is the first direct election of presidents. Normally, the parliament would select the president. They changed the constitution in 2007. First time Turkey votes. This is their 11th president overall, but the first time they voted directly. He got, in some polls I saw, 51.9% of the vote, so between 51 and 52. Now, the good news is it's not as big a win as expected. Originally, he was expected to win by 20 points. He didn't. And then the most recent polls had him winning 54 or 58% of the vote. Again, he didn't, a little bit less. Okay, good. But why? Why did he do so well? Now, here's the really interesting part. Now, look, the easy part is the religious people in Turkey, right? It's the same thing as religious people here in the United States and all over the world. You tell them, this is your leader, you go vote for him no matter what. Don't worry about the issues, don't worry about mining disasters, don't worry about protests. Bow your head and vote for the guy we tell you to. And in a parliamentary system, unfortunately, those people have more power because the secular groups will splinter amongst themselves, but the fundamentalists will always vote for the guy who was declared to be their leader. So he gets that percentage of the vote all the time, and it gives him a huge advantage. But the other part of the people who voted for him are people who did really well during his 11-year tenure as prime minister. That's interesting. Now, see, that's really different. Because here in the US, we're used to fundamentalists being knuckleheads, Prime example number one is George W. Bush. So he comes in, he starts a war he shouldn't have started in Iraq, makes a mess of it, and then he destroys the global economy, not just the US economy, the global economy. Because why? I mean, it was uncontrolled greed, and he didn't care about putting any brakes on it or any regulations. So we're used to our right-wingers being, honestly, stupid. But this guy isn't. And that's perhaps what makes him a little bit more dangerous. Now, let me show you the amazing fact of the day. In the 11 years that Erdogan was prime minister, Turkey's GDP went from $200 billion to $800 billion. He quadrupled the GDP in 11 years. That seems unbelievable. Now, was it just him? Of course not, okay? How he did it is actually the most interesting part. We're gonna get to that in a second. But one more amazing part. The number of people who took domestic flights went from 9 million annually to 76 million. It's just an odd fact brought out by Yale Global, but it's indicative of how much progress there's been economically in Turkey. So this is a topsy-turvy world. How did the fundamentalists wind up doing so well with the economy? Well, Richard Seymour, writing for The Guardian, had a really interesting article about this. He calls him Teflon Tayyip, which is a lot of people do. Tayyip is his first name, and because no matter what he does wrong, he keeps getting elected. Why? Because the economy's booming. What's the number one thing people care about the most? The money, Lebowski, the money, right? So he explains, Richard Seymour does. This is because his policies, however authoritarian and polarizing, have hugely enriched the new Muslim bourgeoisie that forms the bedrock of AKP support. That's his political party. Turkey's economy has almost quadrupled in size since Erdogan became prime minister, and this growth has been punctuated by major infrastructural investments. That last part there is the most interesting part. So it turns out he didn't get success, and if you read more into it, he didn't get success economically because he's fundamentalist. He got it because he did massive infrastructure investment. Now, one of the things he built was airports. Now, you're going to take all those domestic flights and have it go up that much if there are more airports. You couldn't fly around the country without the airports. You couldn't do trade as well across the country if you didn't have the highways. I know because literally the last time I went to Turkey was 11 years ago, and then I just went recently a couple of months ago. And it's night and day. The highways are gorgeous. He built bridges, he built highways, he literally built up the country. And he even went as far as planting flowers all over Istanbul, just so that it looked better. Okay. So what is the fascinating lesson we learned from this? It turns out that this fundamentalist did the most liberal economic policies there are. And that's what wound up having great effect in Turkey. And by the way, they did a debt restructuring too, which allowed them to have the money to do those investments. Now, a lot of people in the US who are conservative economically didn't want them and don't want any of these countries to do debt restructuring. But that debt restructuring wound up having great fruitful results, and by the way, got those debt holders their money back in spades because Turkey did better. So it turns out he had the exact opposite of what pundits in America say you should have, right? And I don't disagree with, look, growing up, I agreed with those pundits. Now I think it's a lot more complicated. But the conventional wisdom was, in America, if you're socially liberal and economically conservative, you'll do better. In this case, the Prime Minister of Turkey and now the President of Turkey was socially conservative and economically liberal. And it turns out that was a winning political coalition and winning economic policy. It's one to grow on. So I do this partly because I don't want anybody to mistake the success of Erdogan for the things he did that did not help. The suppressing the protesters didn't help the economy at all. In fact, it hurt tourism, right? Going and insulting the people who were killed in that mine didn't help the economy. Being, in my opinion, anti-Semitic during the end of this election didn't help. Banning certain forms of media certainly doesn't help the economy. Infrastructure investment, it turns out, helps the economy a lot. And one final thing. One of the ways that he got elected this time around, he promised to build more highways and airports. Turns out people like those. It helps the country. It helps the economy.